Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Ukrainian show on Pod TV. My name is Sasha Star, and today we have, with a great pleasure, Dr. Jonathan Lockwood. Welcome to the show, Jonathan.
Thanks, Sasha. Glad to be here.
Always my pleasure. And Jonathan, I read a lot of and absorbed a lot of material in the last few days, and I want to just come back to regions and reasons for this war, because I feel that, okay, the Russians are horrible murderers, and they attacked Ukraine, which is true, absolutely. But why did they do it? Why? And the question is, well, because Putin is just a born murderer, and that's in his blood, and that's what's happened. And now the support of Russian people was required, because without even, sure, he can do whatever he wants, but at least to engineer the media, the social media, and news channels, and all his propagandists to get wide support, which is now, by the way, even much bigger than at the beginning of the war. Because at the beginning of the war, because the war was supposed to last only 3 days, so there was no need to prepare people for a long, now in its second year war. So okay, so it was expedition. It was how they call it, a special operation. Okay. Yeah, special operation. So they went. Okay, so they didn't go to places like Kursk or Rostov. So instead, they went to Kiev. What's the difference? Kiev is oldest Russian city, and so is Kursk and Voronezh, and just anything. So they just made it this day. They decided to make it Kiev. We have to go all the way back to Munich speech of Putin in 2007. Without that, it's very difficult to understand why and what's happened after that. In that speech, Putin was saying that Russia is no longer happy with the world order, which was created in 1945 as a result of victory of Allied forces over Germany, and which was in place. Uh, Unfortunately, actually, it was not even Putin; it was U.S. who screwed it up, because when Russia, sorry, Soviet Union, ceased to exist at the end of 1991, so there is no more world order, which was basically the winners' agreement, how the world would conduct its affairs. One of the winners just ceased to exist; it's no longer there. So what do? You replace it with Russia. Hey, but what's happened with Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, especially Ukraine and Belarus? Ukraine, because of the numbers, is the greatest force in victory over the Germany, because all territory of Ukraine was taken by Germans, and Ukrainians had to get all the territories back. That's what they're now doing against Russians. Okay, now you may say that Ukraine at that time was part of Soviet Union. So although Ukrainians were fighting, but so the other nations were fighting, and it could be the Buryats and Tatars and Kalmyks and. It's a funny joke is when the Russian, during Second World War, the Russian battalion was encircled by Germans from all, and the Germans used this megaphone, and they're saying with an accent, say, "Русские, сдавайтесь!" Russians, please give up. So the voice from a Russian battalion, the voice is, "Dear German friend, and Tatars also," because he said the Russians give up, So he says he's asking Tatars as well. Anyway, that's kind of a joke because of this. Well, it's just the country that exists. What it calls now Russia has a lot of different nationalities and religions and so on, but we all know that. But following Putin with this incredible, um, well, he didn't propose at the time anything. What he just said that this is where the Russia is striving to be in next few years, maybe 10 years, maybe 20 years. No, nobody knows then. And then Russia started really to put a lot of his budget money into the production of new weapons. And there were some like video done with all this new weaponry or so on. Nobody knows if it exists, whether it works, but there are nice videos of that or so on. So that was 2007, 2008 Georgia, and then 2014 Crimea, Donbass. We know all the rest. Jonathan, how you see it? Is that something of harbinger to become much, much bigger and larger tragedy?
Well, we have to recall that the one of the main motivations, which has become very apparent uh, in Putin's actions in starting the war in Ukraine, is that the Russians were and have been brandishing their nuclear arsenal, and it is the Russians' apparent lack of self awareness is really stunning because the Yeltsin himself had said back in a speech to the Russian Duma in 1994, the only reason Russia is considered a great power is because its armed forces have nuclear weapons. That tells you pretty much all you need to know because Putin obviously regarded and still regards his nuclear arsenal as his main means of leverage against the West and against NATO by
It's
extension.
the only means of leverage.
It's his own, it's
Ukrainians proved it.
yeah, it's his only means of leverage in his perception against the West. Yeah, I mentioned before the fact that the Warsaw Pact had the Soviets had war plans for use of up to 300 nuclear weapons against NATO in the event of a war with NATO. They haven't gotten rid of those plans; they've simply modified them. And to take into account the fact that all of their Eastern European Warsaw Pact members are now members of NATO, so which is and even the neutral ones, which now Finland has joined and lengthened the NATO's
Yes.
more than doubled the length of NATO's border with Russia. And I mean that is a strategic defeat for Russia because the one of the main reasons for starting the war against Ukraine was to stop the expansion of NATO. Instead, he has exacerbated it by persuading Finland and Sweden to join NATO.
Well, at least Sweden
And
doesn't have a border with Russia.
true,
However,
it doesn't.
the
It
interesting
doesn't.
thing will be if Ukraine will join NATO, then
Right.
Russia is completely encircled. They can just
Well, I
say,
wouldn't say
okay,
it's encircled, but they've got one. They will have one heck of a long border with one heck of a long border with NATO. It'll be nearly triple the length of its former length of its border with NATO.
well, let me correct myself. Of course, it's not Russia. It's a European part of Russia. Will be
Right.
almost completely
So
encircled.
it'll still be a much inferior strategic position for Russia than before the start of the war, and they're trying to brandish their nuclear arsenal in every way they can to try and intimidate the West or weaken political support for Ukraine in the long run. Well, right now it's a test of political wills, and I would say right now that the West overall is winning its battle of political will as far as support for Ukraine. And there may be some operational difficulties, such as for the United States replenishing its stock of military weapons. Again, that's an operational problem, not a political will problem. But and I have to point out that there is now a great deal, an excessive amount of speculation in the West, in the Western press, when the Ukrainian counteroffensive is imminent. Where, when, where, how much will it be successful? You get all these other self-styled military experts speculating in the open press. And while some would say that, well, that's not very good operational security because you're essentially telegraphing your intentions to the Russian opponents. On the other hand, during the Cold War, so many opinions were being expressed in the open press that it was very difficult for Soviet analysts to figure out what the intentions of the West really were. What is the real U.S. view? What are the real U.S. intentions? And as a result, because they did not really know, they instead mirror imaged, they projected their own thinking onto the intentions of the West. And they were doing essentially what the Russians assumed that the West was going to do, essentially what they themselves would do if they were in a similar position. So it's very enlightening to see the attitude of the Russian leadership and their projection of their own thought process onto the intentions of the West. And it's in a way in a way refreshing that the Russian mentality really has not changed. It's just that we in the West are not used to seeing it in such a blatant fashion. So that's what kind of takes a lot of us by surprise. It says, how can they be that belligerent or that militant or that fanatical about waging war on Ukraine? Well, the Russians do not see Ukraine. They will never, in a real sense, they will never willingly reconcile themselves to the permanent loss of Ukraine. This is an event which is going to have to be forced on them through a military defeat on the battlefield. And it has to be pretty darn close to decisive military defeat on the battlefield. I still maintain that the timing and effectiveness of the Ukrainian counteroffensive is, regardless of all the speculation and so forth in the West, I believe that it is going to take the Russians. It's going to take the Russians completely by surprise. And the Western analysts make much of the fact that the Russians are building up defenses. They're building up very detailed defensive lines and all this sort of thing. But you have to keep in mind, defensive lines are one thing, but the morale of the fighting troops that occupy those defensive lines, that's quite another. It, you know, they, y- the Ukrainians they could well launch an offensive directly into Crimea and find the Russian defenders surrendering in mass. That could just as well happen. They're not going to fight more fanatically. I mean, the history of the conflict thus far shows that the Russians are totally unwilling to grapple with the Ukrainian forces yet in close combat. So I suspect that a Ukrainian counteroffensive, when it does occur and where it occurs, is going to again exceed the expectations of the West in the degree of its success, and it's going to surprise the Russians too. Well, and greatly alarm the Russians. But that is my take on it. R- Putin thought that his nuclear arsenal gave him leverage. He thought that it gave him the freedom to act and accomplish his objectives without interference from the West. Instead, that calculation of his backfired in a spectacular fashion.
Right.
So,
Even Chinese are so much against not even using nuclear weapons, but even to mention or uh, threatening to use this. And they're saying that essentially threatening to use nuclear weapons is just as horrible as the actual use of those weapons. And so Putin has calculated that there is a rift, considerable rift with China now, because he decided to locate his, I think it's only tactical nuclear weapons in Belarusia. Although now they defect.
if you're on the receiving end, it doesn't matter whether it's tactical or strategic. It's still going to ruin your day.
That's right, but you know what? I think yesterday I've heard that Putin now backtracked it. So actually, they're bringing the machinery that can carry the tactical nuclear devices but not the actual devices. Actual devices they are not bringing, at least at this time. They're not bringing to Belarus. Lukashenko, on the other hand, said that, oh, thanks, Mr. Putin, now Belarus is becoming the nuclear power. Now we can threaten the Vilnius, Lithuania, and Warsaw in Poland, and maybe even England, the London.
Yeah.
What a
Okay, yeah, he
fool!
should have said he should have said, "Okay, oh, thanks a lot, Putin. Now we're a target too."
Exactly. Thank you so much. Actually, Belarus would be very easy target. It's very
Yeah.
conveniently located, and it can be attacked from almost any European country. And they will say, Putin, well, Putin, you're okay, you're a good guy. But that Lukashenko, he's saying that he's going to destroy the Vilnius, the Warsaw, the London, and so on. So we're trying just to to make sure that he's not going to do it, at least not in his lifetime. Now, a very interesting also situation is developing that the actual fights in Ukraine they're becoming more subdued, except Bakhmut. Bakhmut is as horrible place as you can ever imagine, and
It's like the equivalent of Verdun in World War One. I mean, it's
it's
just
equivalent of Stalingrad, and I think it's
in
even
that,
more.
yeah.
It's more horrible than Stalingrad, by the way, and. I'll tell you that right now that the winter is over, so nobody has excuses to take loss in Bakhmut. Not Russians, neither Ukrainians. So they're fighting like it is. In my opinion, yes, it eclipses Stalingrad in some ways. Well,
And that's saying something.
that's saying something. It is really saying something. Yeah. However, the decision of Zelensky to hold on to Bakhmut is, if you if you imagine the map, so Bakhmut is something that with not so much soldiers, Ukrainians can hold on enormous Russian front because Russia cannot move anywhere without taking Bakhmut, and they cannot take Bakhmut, and that's their well, they are
It
trying
puts
to take Bakhmut for the last several months.
yeah, it puts the Russians in a very difficult position as far as trying to move their forces around the exterior of the Ukrainian front, because the
Yeah.
Ukrainians in this case do have the advantage of interior lines. They can move
Mhm.
from within their defensive perimeter. They can move to reinforce any threatened area much more easily than the Russians can maneuver their forces in an effort to achieve superiority on some sector of the front. So yes, the holding of Bakhmut is in one way is, again, if you wanted to use a historical analogy, would be equivalent to the Americans holding the town of Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge in late 1944. Without that road network under their control, the Germans would have a great deal of difficulty trying to expand and exploit what local breakthroughs they had. And that, of course, the Americans were eventually able to begin launching their counteroffensive from the town of Bastogne with reinforcements that they brought up. So, yeah, and anyway, yeah, but holding Bakhmut has been a very good overall to the benefit of the Ukrainians uh, in continuing to hold Bakhmut.
Yeah, this is a heroic page of this war, and I think for generations people will study the defense of Bakhmut and how Ukrainians could do it. Same as yeah, I'm saying in war academies around the world, they study the Stalingrad battle and Verdun, as I mentioned before. These are historic battles that people are studying. So right now, it's very unclear what Putin is trying to do if he is about to lose major support from China. And with that, he is losing support of all the BRIC countries and the other third world countries and so on. Uh, what is his strategy? Where is he going with all that? It's quite pathetic. He's not going to use nuclear weapons. That's quite clear because China and India, never mind NATO countries and US. Okay, that's taboo. And I think it played a evil game with Putin because he so much relied on the his nuclear forces. So if he has nuclear forces and somebody like Ukraine doesn't have, there should not be even a war in the first place. When he moved and he wanted to take Kiev in 3 days, Kiev should have said that, yeah, okay, I want to take all Kiev or just half Kiev, or what exactly do you want, right? Please let us know. Not at all, not even close to it. So now he is becoming a hostage of his own nuclear power because of relying on that, but not being able to use it for various reasons. If he wouldn't have the nuclear forces, he would beef up his conventional forces, and he would build enough artillery, tanks, and so on, and he would rely only on that. And I'm pretty sure he would be more successful on the battlefield than he is today. You agree with that, John?
Uh, the except that for the fact that the Soviet slash Russian leadership, they viewed nuclear weapons as being decisive, simply because they were watching the example of the United States and how the United States was able to exert restraint on Soviet expansionism through first its massive retaliation doctrine, then subsequently through flexible response and its other strategic doctrines, all under the overall U.S. strategy of containment. You know, the idea was that the United States should have nuclear superiority in order to restrain the ability of the Soviet Union to expand through either intimidation or actual conquest. And the the Soviets, leadership learned their lesson from that example, that they must have nuclear weapons also, and that they must have more and have the ability to strike the United States. From their perception, it was their attainment of nuclear parity with the United States that, in effect, from their point of view, gave them more leverage and more freedom of action to use their own military forces in support of their own foreign policy objectives. They they were relatively cautious about doing this, but the primacy of nuclear weapons in Soviet slash Russian thinking has been consistent from the very beginnings of the Cold War through the present. And it is that one consistent perception which has motivated and molded Putin's thinking to the exclusion of all else. So even during Khrushchev's period, yeah, leadership, he saw the importance of having nuclear weapons as a means of leverage, and so he wanted to emphasize that, and he thought that that would give him a reason to actually reduce the size of the Soviet armed forces. Uh, but we must keep in mind that it is that primacy of nuclear weapons in Russian thinking that has motivated their behavior to date, and we're seeing the consequences of it now. When that obviously not only does not achieve their objectives, but it backfires and resulting in the expansion and strengthening of their main opponent, NATO. Uh, they have to reconsider. It says, have we've been going about this all wrong? And unfortunately for them, it's probably too late to change their thinking.
Agree. But you see, advantage of having nuclear weapons twofold, in my opinion. One is ability to threaten use of nuclear forces, and second, actual use of nuclear forces. It seems to me that Russians, okay, they were threatening, but they did it so uh, weakly and unconvincingly, and there were such uproar from even countries like China and India that were supposed to be friendly to Russia and were friendly actually. That didn't do anything. In fact, nobody pays attention anymore to all these nuclear threats. To actually use that is impossible for several reasons, which we discussed earlier. So again, in my opinion, this is becoming a liability. Really, okay. Here's a great nuclear power, not even second to United States, but maybe even on par with the United States. Maybe even it has a bigger warhead, a bigger number of warheads than the United States, perhaps, but doesn't do anything at all to help them to take over Bakhmut. You can have so many warheads and you cannot take Bakhmut. This is calamity. This is absolute. It's a, and they already have so many people killed over there. I'm looking at. Remember, I told you the Ukrainian Pravda, which daily uh, gives you account of was what just for last day yesterday, 530 Russian soldiers were killed, 8 tanks destroyed, and 6 BMP, and 3 artillery systems, 9 the outer, the including the what they use to carry the gasoline, and finally 15 drones. And yesterday was not really that special day, but just daily. So the Ukrainian meat grinder is working. Is the only thing it's not every day as effective as because it really heavily depends
They're
on
running
the
out of they're running
supply.
out of they're running out of targets.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. The supply is there,
Yeah,
Russian. Sometimes
the
they
supply of
provide.
Russian soldiers to for them to grind up, it's getting lower. I mean, it's a sign of the growing exhaustion of the growing increasing exhaustion of the Russian offensive, and the fact that
Yeah,
it has just about run out of gas.
yeah,
And so now it's now a question of it's like in a boxing match. One boxer has been throwing all the punches that it can, and it's been blocked and counterpunched successfully by the Ukrainian boxer. And now the Ukrainian boxer, who's relatively fresh and getting stronger, is just looking for the opening to throw the knockout punch.
yeah, yeah. And the Ukrainian propaganda also does its jobs quite well. What they're talking to Russian soldiers, they're saying, boys, you have 3 options. Option number one, you came to Ukraine, you will be lie in our Ukrainian earth, and that's where you came for, and that's where you're going to remain forever. Now, option number two, run away. Run away back to Russia anywhere you can. Now, option number three, just give up. Give up. We will treat you well. You will be treated well, and you will be taken care of. That's 3 options you have. Choose wisely. That's kind of well, we'll see how it all works. In the meantime, Jonathan, I would like to thank you so much for participating in today's program, and we'll see
Thank you.
you soon on Friday. Bye bye, John.
Hey, thank you.